Welcome back, post Labor Day, end of summer, to another interview with our state senator, Bruce Tarr. How are you, Senator?
Hi, Heather. I'm doing great, thanks. How are you?
Good, I'm good. It feels like summer out there.
I was going to say, meteorologically and astronomically, and by some other metrics, summer may have ended, but it sure doesn't feel like it on Cape Ann today. And it didn't feel like it yesterday. And I'm not even sure it's going to feel like the end of summer for this whole week.
I know. So maybe that's why the state Senate is in informal session still. Are you guys still like just extending the summer vacation a little bit?
What a great segue. So,
Right?
we obviously Labor Day just happened, and we generally would return to formal session sometime post Labor Day. It's not uncommon for it to take a while, and I think that's certainly going to be the case right now. But we will eventually get back to formal session. And part of the reason for that is we still have the vast majority of our bills have not been reported out by their respective committees. And so there will be a point in time when we'll start to see those bills get reported, and we'll see the pace of legislative activity pick up. Also, there are some conference committees that are meeting. One of the most notable is the Conference Committee on Tax Relief. As a refresher, I think we all recall that the governor filed a tax relief bill, the House passed a version of it, the Senate passed a version of it. So there's widespread agreement that there should be some tax relief, but the final details haven't been worked out by the conference committee. And that's one of the first things that I'm expecting will bring us back to formal session, is to consider that conference committee report. So for right now, the wheels are turning, but they're not turning in the form of formal sessions. I anticipate they will be at some point over the next couple of weeks, but I don't think it'll be this week, and I doubt it will be next week either.
And what committees are you sitting on, and what can you tell us what bills you're working on in those committees?
Well, it's probably easier to tell you the subject matter that I'm working on, because I actually am on 16 committees, and so and a lot of those committees have a tremendous number of bills in front of them, and we haven't really digested a work plan yet. But I will tell you that I am concerned about controlling the cost of healthcare, so we're working on some legislation relative to that. I am on the conference committee relative to tax relief, so I'm working on that. And also continuing to do a lot of work on energy and grid modernization, because I think that's an important issue. And I recently met with the Secretary of Economic Affairs to talk with her about that. And we have a common interest in moving that forward. And one of the other projects that I've just begun working on, which is the primary reason I was meeting with the Secretary, was to talk about the potential to re-domesticate pharmaceutical production in Massachusetts. A lot of drugs are invented here, patented here, researched here, but we don't have a lot of production. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But I think that we could be engaging in an initiative similar to re-domesticating the production of computer microchips with pharmaceuticals. And so that's another issue that I'm working on as well. And then we have some veterans legislation that's in the pipeline that we're working on in my office, soon to be filed. So you're getting a little bit of a scoop here, Heather, but we have for a while now felt that merchant marines who are veterans because they served in a particular period of time when they were engaged in a war effort have never been properly recognized in Massachusetts. And we have some legislation that we're going to be filing relative to that. And we also have legislation that we are still working on relative to recognizing veterans who will ultimately be recognized after they die for their military service originating from Massachusetts. But there are a category of these folks that we can't recognize while they're alive. And so we're working on trying to create some form of recognition for them so that we can actually have the honor of looking them in the eye and presenting them with something while they're still living and while they're still with us. So we have a lot on our plate drafting wise, and certainly in that category is continuing to look at the issue of drought and water management and water resilience. So we've got a lot of irons in the fire, but none of them yet have risen to the level of being reported from a committee. But we certainly hope that that's all going to be happening soon.
So I sort of hear a lot, or I read a little bit about how this is a bit of a trend in the Massachusetts legislature. Things are moving very slowly. you're nodding your head in agreement. What do you think?
That is definitely true, and it's something that I have been trying to address for a number of years. And just to get into the weeds just a little bit, so we have a date called Joint Rule 10 Day, by which committees are supposed to report out all of the bills that are before them. And it's been a trend that some committees have not been meeting that deadline, and they ask for extensions. And not only do they ask for extensions, but they ask for multiple extensions. And those have to be approved by the House and the Senate. And I've been engaging in fairly persistent floor debate about why those extensions should be granted, why they're being asked for, to see if we can get back to a time when we respect that date much more than we have been doing. Because as you would synopsize from listening to this conversation, we need the committees to report the bills before we can take action. And so that's why there's been some delay. And that also translates into having log jams at the end of the formal session when we're trying to consider very complex bills within a very short time frame. And it's because they haven't been reported to us. So I think we need to work a lot harder at backing the process up so that bills get reported more in a timely way and that we can consider them with the amount of time that they really should have for consideration. So your observation is one that I completely agree with. And I think we need to do better at trying to move the process faster. Now, within that, there's also the issue of disagreement between the branches as to how certain bills should be treated, which committees they should go to even begin the process. And that's something that we need to work on too. And it's a part of the legislative process that may not get a lot of attention, but it's very important in terms of having an orderly way for the branches to agree to get bills to committees and to get them out of committees. And one of the things that we did in the rules debate in the Senate after we convened for the new session was make some changes that we think would help in those instances. But those rules are in a conference committee. So we have not even adopted a set of new rules for this legislative session. We're operating on the rules from the prior session by default. So when it comes to process, there's a lot of work to be done. And it's as important as the substance, because without the proper infrastructure to consider bills, you can't achieve the objectives that the bills themselves are trying to reach.
Right. And it seems as if you spent a lot of time necessarily, maybe and a good third of the end of the session focused on the budget for the following year, right?
We did, and to be honest, that's not unusual. The budget takes a lot of time because it's a very complex document. Not only does it spend billions of dollars for spending priorities that have to be agreed upon, but it also contains policy measures, and those oftentimes are very sophisticated kinds of concepts. I'll give you an example. In the most recent budget, we had to debate a lot how we were going to approach the issue of free community college. And you may recall the governor had proposed something called Mass Reconnect for people that were over the age of 25. The Senate has long held as a priority trying to reach students at the beginning of their postgraduate or post-secondary educational career. And so those two things had to be reconciled. And I actually think we reached a fairly good result. But so there's substance of that nature and there's spending, and all of that takes a lot of consideration, particularly, Heather, in the context that we're in right now, where we finished the last fiscal year not with a surplus, but actually with I don't want to call it a deficit because it isn't actually a deficit, but we had a shortfall between what we had pegged spending at to support the budget and what we actually collected. And that shortfall was about $600 million. Now, we found ways to address that, but it wasn't the normal situation where you were looking ahead to a surplus, which gives you a lot more flexibility. So in all of that context, the budget did take a long time. Took longer than I would have liked. I think it should have been done sooner. But there were some circumstances that required a fairly significant amount of time.
So do you think, and I don't mean to get too weedy here, but, or maybe this isn't weedy at all. Do you think it's the complexity of these bills that is stalling the committees? Are things just very, no, you're shaking your head, no.
So bills, a lot of bills by their very nature are complex, and
Mm.
they involve sensitive subjects, and they involve subjects where people have different opinions, and those opinions need to be received in the form of testimony and public hearings. They need to be digested. They need to be incorporated into the legislative process. So the legislative process by its nature is oftentimes slow because, particularly in Massachusetts, it's inclusive. And it takes time to integrate all of those components and all of those perspectives. But what I would say is that oftentimes things could be going faster in terms of matters that are much more routine, or matters that we've dealt with before that are moving through the process for the second time or the third time, and they could be moving a little bit more quickly. So I think the rules are important here. And I know rules sometimes are not glamorous, and sometimes they're considered to be monotonous, but the rules are the infrastructure by which we operate in a timely and efficient manner when they're done right.
Okay, I have one last question for you, I think. So I think you have mentioned this before, and you just sort of explained it all very well. Does it make sense to load up the budget with all kinds of great things, like all policy initiatives and spending, because you know what'll happen, right? Is that true?
Well, that's exactly why people do attempt to do that, because they know that there's a lot of uncertainty in the process of going through a committee and operating in the terminology that we would use as a standalone bill. And so folks do try to use the budget as a vehicle. And that's one of the questions that we always have to address is, what is the right balance of putting something in the budget versus causing it to travel in that standalone path? And sometimes, particularly in the Senate, there's a trend more to try to use the budget because the Senate does not control the committees. Most of the joint committees have 11 members of the House and only 6 members of the Senate. And so sometimes senators will say, because we don't have the controlling number of votes in a committee, we're going to try to use the budget. And there are always decisions made there, and there's always a fine line that moves. Sometimes the House will put policy in the budget, sometimes the Senate will put policy in the budget, but oftentimes it is those elements of policy that wind up being the stumbling point to getting a budget done in a timely way. Sometimes the conference committee will actually hold them in conference and report out the rest of the budget in order to meet the deadline of trying to get a budget done by the beginning of the fiscal year. So we have a lot of options, but again, it's perhaps easily explained, but not easily accomplished.
Well, that was a good civics lesson. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, it's always a pleasure to be on 1623 with you on a beautiful day on Cape Ann, talking about the intricacies of legislative process.
Well, I really enjoy it. So is there anything else you want to leave us with before we go?
I will only leave you with the thought that we are watching our revenue collections very carefully. They're moving in a positive direction. We know that we closed the fiscal year with that gap that I mentioned, but it appears that we're again moving in the right direction. But in the months ahead, we're going to be watching that carefully, and I look forward to being able to share those observations with you as we move through the rest of the fiscal year.
Well, thank you. All right, get out there in that sunshine. Enjoy.
Okay. Perhaps I'll go outside and read some legislation. But Heather, it's always a pleasure, and thanks to you. And again, thanks to everyone at 1623 for allowing us this opportunity to talk.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.